Hi, I'm Clare MacGillivray. I'm the director of Making Rights Real, a charity that's 2 years old and supports communities to name and claim their rights. I'm really sorry that I can't be with you in person, but I want to thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm setting this context about how to use human rights in practice to tackle inequalities. And the inequalities that we face are extreme at the moment. At a time when inflation is at its highest for 40 years, we've got a neoliberal economy that delivers massive profits for energy companies at the expense of the poorest who are struggling to survive. And public services are crippled with exhausted staff, limited budgets, and we're all living in post-COVID trauma. So if there was ever a time for radical change in how our public services work, it's now. And you're all at the front of leading that change that we need and delivering what matters to people. But you're not alone, because we're in a context where new human rights legislation is being developed to bring international human rights treaties into Scots law. And there are opportunities for rights holders to be at the heart of policy making and shaping budgets. And that'll deliver real change for the people who need the change most. But how can a rights-based approach help to shift how meaningful co-production happens? What's at stake here? How do we use human rights in practice? And I'm hoping that communities featured in this presentation will inspire you to use human rights in practice. What do you think about when you think about inequality? Are you thinking about data? Are you thinking about people? Are you thinking about both? What does inequality feel like in Scotland? I want you to get a picture in your head that means something to you, something that you can visualise about what you want to see changed around inequality in Scotland. Here are some of the pictures that help me to be reminded about inequality in Scotland. I'm going to talk about it a little later, but these were taken by residents in a housing block in Leith. And these were some of the issues that they were facing every day. This is what inequality looked like for them. So what are marginalised groups' experiences of public services? Where do people on low incomes go to keep warm when their food and energy bills soar beyond 40% of their annual income? What does this say about the wealth inequality we've got in Scotland? What would Gypsy Traveller or Roma people in Scotland say about their experiences of poor housing, education that might not be culturally appropriate? What about people with no recourse to public funds, some of them cooped up in hotel rooms for months or years? What do they think of their egregious breaches of human rights and what public services are doing for them? How do children and young people shape our services? What do they think of the education services they're getting? What about disabled people or people who are LGBT and have to wait 2 years to access health services? And what about people of colour? How are they involved in designing our services that are culturally appropriate? How's the gender perspective taken in public finance budgets? And what do you do if you've got multiple structural inequalities and you're facing a double or triple whammy? What does public services feel like for you? So I'm wanting to ask, are we really ready for a culture change that needs to happen to shift inequality? Are you ready? Is your organisation ready? Is your community ready? If you're thinking about inequality, it's helpful to start with thinking about human rights. Where do you see human rights being breached in your work life, in your families, and how they're experiencing their human rights? In your community, where do you see human rights already being breached? I'll give you a moment just to think about that space, what that looks like for you and for the people you're working alongside. It's important to note that change doesn't happen quickly enough for the people who need the change most. So the people who are most marginalised need changes now in their life. And things often don't happen quickly enough when we're reshaping services to be able to meet the needs of people who need the change most. When we talk about human rights, we're talking about the relationship really between rights holders and duty bearers. Rights holders being you, me, all of us who have human rights by virtue of being human, and duty bearers like the state, public authorities and businesses who have responsibilities or obligations to respect, protect and fulfil our rights. I love this quote by Eleanor Roosevelt, who was on the drafting committee for the Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, 75 years ago this year. And she said, "Where do human rights begin? In small places close to home, so close and so small that they can't be seen on the map of the world. Yet they're the world of the individual, the neighbourhood, the school or college they attend, the factory, farm or office where they work. And unless those rights have meaning there, they have little meaning." So how do we put into action human rights, the human rights that Eleanor Roosevelt talked about in the Declaration of Human Rights, in those small places close to home? Human rights are not just in international law courts, but they are for people to be able to use in a practical way. And we have a rights-based approach using the panel principles, which are well documented across the world as being able to support the active realisation of rights. And the principles are quite simple, really. The first one is about participation and making sure that the people who are most affected by rights are able to be involved in any process that's discussing those rights. The second one is about accountability and how are public authorities accountable to the people who they're serving. The third one about non-discrimination is really about who are the people who are the furthest from the table, the furthest from decision making, and making them right at the heart of the process, and empowering them to be able to name and claim their rights. The last principle of the panel principles is about legality. What changes on the back of all of that participation? What processes change? What laws change? What structures change to be able to improve people's rights? In Scotland, the Human Rights Commission developed the FAIR process as a four-stage way to practically apply a rights-based approach. And we've used it in community development work in Making Rights Real. And the 4 steps are about establishing the facts. What do rights holders say about what's happening in the service? What are the rights that are at stake? Who's responsible for those rights? For those, making sure those human rights issues are dealt with, and how can we review the actions against the facts to make sure that progress happens. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Housing Rights and Practice project. If you've heard me speaking before, you'll be sick of this, but it's only because we don't have other videos yet for Making Rights Real of the work that we're doing. But these were some of the conditions that I talked about earlier. Residents living in 4 blocks of housing in Leith were facing dampness issues and maintenance issues around rats and mice infestations and poor kitchens. So I hope you're up for that challenge that the former chair of the Scottish Human Rights Commission gave to us. I know at Making Rights Real, on the back of that project in Leith, we set up the organisation to be able to work alongside communities to name and claim their human rights. And we do that in several ways: by human rights monitoring, by supporting communities to learn about their rights, and supporting them to take collective action on their rights. You'll see some of the photographs here of the women who are involved in our 7 project at the top, and Wise Women Glasgow at the bottom left, who have been action planning around human rights and women's safety, and a living room in the Toon in Trinent, where we took out a survey about gender inequality to the streets of Trinent and sat up a living room in the Toon to be able to chat to folk about their rights. Some of the other work that we're doing in terms of other communities using human rights is we're working with 3 Gypsy traveller communities on their rights and the right to accommodation, and particularly also around the right to education. We had a project where we wanted to recruit 7 women to talk about economic, social and cultural rights, and to put on an international play called Seven at the Scottish Parliament for Human Rights Day last year. We recruited 22 women from different groups across Scotland, and I'm really delighted to say that their next performance of Seven will be in Fife on the 9th of September at the Carnegie Hall. So watch out for that on our social media. We're also doing work around gender-based budgeting around with the cost of living and the right to an adequate standard of living, and that's with the Women and Girls group in East Lothian. And we've been talking about the right to health with groups who are campaigning around health, from Caithness, Skye, Dumfries and Galloway, and bringing them together to talk about why human rights is applicable for them in terms of accessing the right to health. We're also talking with a group in Glasgow looking at women's safety in transport, and they've just presented their first ideas around how they can move forward an action plan on women's rights and safety. So there's lots of groups around Scotland who are starting to use human rights in practice, which is wonderful. It's starting that change of rights being right at the heart of what happens for public services in Scotland and how people experience those rights. But how does co-production fit with a human rights-based approach? I know that you're talking about co-production today as well, and it's really interesting to think about how they fit together. For me, the best resource in Scotland around co-production is at CoPro Scotland website, so do have a look at that. But really, co-production fits very well with the rights-based approach because it's about people participating alongside public authorities, sharing power to shift systems about public services so that people are not having decisions made about them, but it's about making decisions alongside public authorities and working together to make change happen. It's really about talking about power as well, because we have to share power. We have to talk about power if we really want to use a rights-based approach in practice. And we know that societal power structures are replicated in organisations and sectors, and our own sectors are no different. So the challenge we face is looking at our own positionality and power and asking searching questions that can lead to transformative action. Who controls the purse string in our organisations? How is racial capitalism, colonialism, or wealth inequality factored into our work? How can we transform the work that we do so that it's participative and it's intersectional? And how do people with multiple deprivation participate in decision makers? How do we hold each other to account? And how can they be empowered to name and claim their rights? I always like to ask, who's round the table? Who's participating in decisions that are being made? And probably more importantly, who's not round the table? Which faces are not round the table? Who's experiencing inequality but isn't there to be able to help to shift how inequality is delivered or dealt with in Scotland? So I'll ask again, what are marginalised groups' experiences of public services in Scotland? How do you know? Who have you asked? And how are you able to get into conversation with those people who need the change most? When I'm working with communities, a lot of people talk around authenticity of relationships, that there's unequal power, and that sometimes public authorities can be defensive in their organisational approach to engaging with people, that they're maybe a bit risk averse, or that the workforce feel disempowered and they're not able to make the decisions which actually would deliver real change. We'll also hear quite a lot about the fear of the other. Public authorities sometimes fear engaging with communities who are difficult to reach or actually easy to ignore. And sometimes communities feel being in that position where you're engaging with power. If your experiences have not been good, then how do you shift that thought process? I explored some of these in the Fearless podcast series that I did recently, where I interviewed human rights defenders across Scotland. And you can check that out on the website or via Twitter. But what that highlighted was that there are real difficulties for people speaking truth to power in Scotland. We're not immune to folk experiencing death threats, where one person that I interviewed said they'd made peace with the fact that they could be killed. And I was naive to think that that wasn't an issue in Scotland. People have also talked about toxic trolling, and is it safe to be a human rights defender to speak up against issues which they feel are not protecting their human rights? People talked about their mental ill health and physical ill health being impacted in the constant fight for rights by not being believed or being isolated. They were feeling alone. Some were plagued with self-doubt, questioning their ability to speak out. And there was a lot of burnout or withdrawal from people who actually wanted to speak truth to power but couldn't. There were also threats about people losing their jobs, and fears in the voluntary sector that there were complex issues around commissioning, so that if you worked for an organisation that's funded by the state, what does that mean? Does it mean that you're able to speak truth to power? Or does the clause in the procurement contract that you have with or your organisation has with the local authority talk about not bringing the organisation into disrepute? So there were lots and lots of issues around positionality and power and epistemic injustice about whose story is told in the narrative that we talk around our public services in Scotland. And I'll leave that with a final question. Are we really progressive in Scotland? For people who are experiencing inequality, it doesn't feel like it. But what helps? People talked about bringing your whole self to the process. You're brilliant leaders in your own public authorities and the organisations that you work with. So what works for you? What helps? Time to build those meaningful relationships and trust, and actively listening to people who need the change most. Actively deconstructing your own power and the power that's in your organisation to help to make change happen. And recognising that not everyone experiences inequality in the same way, but we can use an intersectional human rights-based approach to help to shift systems. Where we're rooting change in human rights, you're able to see a progressive realisation of rights. You're able to see what changes. You're able to measure what works and what helps people who need the change most. And we've got international frameworks to help us along that. And also it helps in terms of speaking truth to power, because when we're using human rights, we're recognising human rights defenders, people like yourself who want to make change happen. Change doesn't happen quickly enough for the people who need change most. But what we're blessed with in Scotland is people who are ready to make a culture for change, who have got the door open, who are here today talking about how to make that shift happening. People like you who are fire starters, who want to make the change happen, who can light the fires that we need to see in Scotland to shift public services. So I hope that you'll join me in being a fire starter and using human rights in practice to help change happen for the people who need change most. Enjoy the rest of your day. And I've been Clare MacGillivray at Making Rights Real. Do follow us and have an amazing rest of the day.